We have a terrific task ahead of us. We have a shattered world around us, and we must help to rebuild it.
Сегодня еще раз обращаюсь ко всем гражданам России.
The President of the United States.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Seats of Power radio show. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Jean Claude Cachia. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So just make sure everything is correct. Today we're going to be talking about the future of the EU, essentially, certain events that keep on happening in Europe and the whole political institution, essentially, where there are some questions, obviously, that people would like answers to. So obviously we feel like this would be a perfect episode to have you on. So that's obviously we're here. Thank you for coming, firstly. Could you give a little bit of your background to the viewers that are listening?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for inviting me to discuss such an interesting topic. Yes, basically, I am a lecturer within the Institute for European Studies, and I mostly focus on politics within the European Union, and also European security. Obviously, both are linked then with the future of the European Union, security being one of the areas which the European Union is pushing for further integration, but obviously within that area there has been growing skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Well, why? Where is that growing skepticism coming from?
Skepticism towards the European Union has always been there. Obviously, in the last few years, this skepticism has increased. Although I have seen in 2019 European election, there has been a growing awareness of these elections. And also the European Union has stepped up by obviously promoting the European Union issues. And we have seen in 2019 the trend, especially for the turnout, increasing to now above 50%. But yes, there has been skepticism for the growing powers of the European Union, skepticism for the politicians which lead the European Union. And the idea that obviously the European Union is growing at the expense of the nation states.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, yes, I can definitely recognize that there is that feeling among the people in Europe, because there's a lot of countries and state leaders you could mention like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Meloni in Italy, where they're a bit more focused on their national project rather than the international European collaboration. Yes, I would agree with that.
I think that makes sense, though, because they're sovereign states on their own.
Of course.
First, then the European identity comes second.
I don't know.
I think that's the growing, not growing. That's always been. That's why, for example, in 2004, when there was a proposed constitution, that I believe it was France and the Netherlands who voted against it, because they're firstly, if I'm Maltese, first I'm Maltese, then I'm European, is my thought.
But especially in Malta, the Eurobarometer service highlighted the fact that Maltese feel themselves to be Maltese and European.
That's true.
So there has been a growing awareness. But when you mention, obviously, referendums, who mentioned European elections previously, then you have to analyze on which issues voters do actually vote for. Because it can be the constitution, but at the same time, people are voting to send a message to the government. Mm-hmm. So we always have a problem with the European elections. That they have been created to debate European issues, but as you know, in most member states, it is national issues which obviously are priority. But yes, there is always the debate within the EU. National interest, European interest, which one comes first? But Meloni and Viktor Orban, obviously there has been a shift. I think Meloni, especially when she was elected, many have branded her far right. Obviously, it's a threat to the European project. But we have seen she has worked with the EU politicians. She has supported Ukraine. Obviously, Orban has so far, although he supported it, he's been very much resistant. So their skepticism towards the European Union, I think, is different.
What I wanted to bring up is, you know who Fidesz is, the Cypriot independent European member of European Parliament. He was, I believe this week or last week, he was on Andrew Tate's podcast. And they did this round of quick-fire questions. And in it, he said, and this ties into something else I'll bring up now, that Fidias said that members of European Parliament alone can't change anything alone. I agree with that, but could that be a reason why they're also people are also skeptic towards European elections? Because they can't really change anything on their own.
That's an interesting debate going on.
That's
Obviously, the European Parliament, the European Commission is the one who initiates legislation. The European Parliament can approve the Commission for the first time in a number of years. The European Commission was approved as a whole. Usually in the past, we have some commissioners who are rejected by the European Parliament. This year, it seems obviously the fact that the European Parliament is divided into multiple forces meant that the lobbying between different parties meant everyone was voted through. So yes, but then obviously it is the member states who, within the European Council who have the ability, who might want to strengthen the European Parliament. Obviously, will come at the expense of the member states, so they will never do that at the expense of their own power. We have seen an examples, obviously, within the vacuum of power of the European Union, obviously the rise of von der Leyen. She has been also criticized that she's trying, obviously, to gain more power at the expense of the other institutions. But then you have to see the reaction that the other institutions will have towards her approach. We have seen some examples, the conflict in the Middle East. You had the first reaction of President von der Leyen, but then you have seen the reaction of the high representatives who say that obviously within the foreign policy, within the external action, it is his responsibility and not hers.
That makes sense, I guess.
I want to touch back on something you said, because there's countries that obviously they look after their national interest first, and I agree with you that there definitely are. But there's also the case of EU law supremacy. So, for example, did recently had a presentation for a class, and I touched upon the Costa versus ENEL case in 1964, which literally, establishes the supremacy of EU law. So when it comes in that context, I think you can make the argument that legally, at least, it's EU that reigns first, and it's not the member states.
Legally, yes, it's a supranational authority, so it does.
Although there have been some cases in member states where they challenge the supremacy of the EU law.
Yes.
And obviously that creates a conflict between the member states. There is the supremacy of the EU law, so in technicality you can introduce a legislation required by the European Union, but then the question is whether the legislation is actually effective. You have a number of legislation for the European Union which are extremely vague. So they are based on multiple interpretations. I mean, look in the case of Malta and the hunting regulation. The fact that it can be interpreted in multiple ways. Obviously, that means that the member states can interpret the legislation the way they want.
But they're still under Article 267 of the TFEU then. I sound like a law student, sorry. But they still have or I don't know if it's obligatory, but the preliminary ruling procedure. That still goes on. The procedure is that when a member state needs clarity on a certain regulation, correct me if I'm wrong, they ask the Court of Justice of the European Union to then tell them how to apply it. But then it's up to the country. The Court of Justice doesn't rule it for the country. The country decides how to rule. There was actually a case with Arsenal Football Club. I believe it was Arsenal. In 2006, there was, when you go to a football stadium and outside there's people selling scarves and stuff, which aren't really official, but they're just selling them outside the stadium. I believe it was Arsenal, but it could be another club. They charged him on trademark laws because he was selling items that weren't trademarked, and the Court of Justice of the UK ruled against the man and in favor of Arsenal. But then, or what did it rule? I forgot how it ruled. But basically, the Court of Justice swapped the decision. But then it was up to the Court of Justice of Britain to decide how to act. But the Court of Justice of the EU told them how they should. So it's
They
still
set
supreme.
precedent, essentially.
Not that, but it's just. I think it is still
I mean,
supreme.
if you look at the last enlargement from 2004 onwards, member states have to abide by a set of criteria. The acquis communautaire Copenhagen criteria. But then questions arose when they joined the European Union, whether they were actually abiding by this criteria, whether they simply introduced them superficially. But then obviously the problems started. The same thing when it comes to the single market, whether states were abiding by the single market, the Eurozone, and the single currency, and obviously then a problem started with the European Union when it emerged that a number of states were obviously closing an eye to these regulations. If you look at the Eurozone crisis, obviously it started with one state, but then it affected at least the majority of the Mediterranean states.
Yeah, it affected us as well. But I don't remember it. I was 4, so.
I don't remember it either, and I was 5.
But then the single market was obviously a very a big challenge for the European Union for the fact that obviously you have to decide what to do. I mean, you can't have Greece defaulting. Many still say that obviously if Greece defaulted, it would have recovered much quicker than it did. I mean, look at the case of Iceland. It defaulted, but then its economy now it regained strength and it's one of the most attractive countries for investment. And then obviously the question is, then you have the collectivity, you have the debt. What kind of relief should you give to one country? Then obviously the crisis spread to others. But the same thing with the Syrian migration crisis. I mean, it started with one country, it spread all over. You have countries quickly closing their borders. There should have been obviously the supremacy of the EU regulations, but obviously within that chaos, the European Union is not known for making speedy decisions. The same thing with the COVID pandemic. I mean, with the COVID pandemic, when Italy was one of the first countries to decide to close its borders. At first, the European Union said it is not necessary, but obviously when states started to close their borders, then a collective decision was taken.
That makes sense as well. Jake's laughing. I don't
No, nothing. I just saw something on my phone pop up.
sorry. Professional.
With regard to the rise of right-wing parties in Europe. Two questions essentially. Firstly, how do you think that's happened? Like, why are people flocking to the right? And second question is, how has the EU reacted to that? And has there been anything sort of more than just rhetoric with regards to it?
That's a very interesting question. Obviously, when we discuss the rise of the far right, we usually focus on the party, but we don't actually understand why they are being voted. And there can be various answers for that, including the fact that obviously the political system is not catering for their own voters, the fact that there is a growing political apathy in Europe, but we usually try to contain the rise of these far-right political parties without really understanding why they're being voted for. I mean, look at the last election in parliamentary election in France. After the election, everyone, especially the second round, everyone was debating that obviously we managed to contain the rise of Marine Le Pen. But then the question should be, why Marine Le Pen was still voted by 11 million voters. So the question is why they actually voted for her. Rather than going to the roots of the problem, we're simply trying to isolate the political party, which might have won the largest amount of seats and the largest amount of votes. Similar approach of the European Union, obviously trying to contain the rise of the far right in multiple ways. But at some point, obviously, now we have the parliamentary elections in Germany as well. Alternative for Germany is increasing its influence. But I think at some point, at the moment, the strategy is to try and isolate these political parties from gaining power.
Do you think that I guess, action makes those parties less popular or more popular? Because I think I would make the argument that doing that sort of isolation that you're explaining is counterproductive ultimately, and it will only lead to those parties gaining more popularity.
Yeah, it could be really counterproductive. I mean, if you look at the Spitzenkandidat in debates within the European Union, a number of questions have been raised that obviously von der Leyen was now working with Giorgia Meloni, and the threat that Giorgia Meloni posed for the European Union. But Giorgia Meloni is the Prime Minister of Italy. So you need to work with one of the founding members of the European Union, and obviously one of the largest states, the
Exactly.
third or fourth largest economy within the European Union. So the European Union needs to work with these individuals which are democratically elected in power. You cannot simply isolate them. There has been an attempt, and obviously Meloni, I forgot if they abstained or voted against the nomination of von der Leyen. But yes, obviously, in an ideal world, Europeanists would work or would gain the largest amount of votes, which they still do within the European Parliament, but obviously they are divided into multiple forces. So it means that you have to work with everyone in order to try and reach a consensus. Because there has been far right and far right. I mean, if you look at the Patriots and the European Conservatives, obviously, the question is why they are divided into multiple groups. Because far-right political parties, they also fight with each other. At some point, it was interesting. Obviously, there has been a conflict between Marine Le Pen and at some point, not Delega, Salvini, and the fact that obviously they brand each other out to be far-right political parties.
I think it's common in far-right politics. Like you said, they always fight with each other.
Yes.
And I'll add to you that Meloni voted against the re-election of von der Leyen. So, goes to show.
And obviously, far-right, there has been... Because I'm looking at now, I'm looking at the different skepticism. And one of the skepticism categories under skepticism is strategic skepticism. The idea, you have ideological skepticism. And I think if you look at Salvini, he's very much ideologically against the European Union. But obviously, Meloni, who is now in power, she has to work with the European Union. It's interesting that many of them in the past have mentioned the idea of leaving the European Union or leaving the single currency. But nowadays, when they can get in power, that discussion is usually muted down. After Brexit and the messy discussions that existed, that obviously, I think some states are now more or less reluctant to leave the European Union.
Obviously, Brexit isn't attractive for anyone, for any state, really. I don't think Italy would benefit really from leaving
I think
the Union.
Personally, and this might be completely, impossible, but in my mind, if there's going to be more countries that leave the EU, they're not going to leave one at a time. I think there would be an operation where it would be planned in advance in a way that they would try and mitigate the damage, I guess.
Could be, but I don't...
How would you do that through a referendum, though?
No, I'm not talking about referendums. I'm talking leaders of countries that, in conjunction with each other, essentially decide, listen, we reject the idea of Europe in a political sense.
Well, I don't think that would happen in the near
I
future.
I literally just said it's probably impossible,
Yeah,
but I think that's the only way.
You never know. I
realistically.
mean, there has been, we mentioned far right, but there has been even political parties at the far left.
Yes, obviously.
No,
Especially in Spain.
And Greece.
As well.
When Syriza rose to power, the idea was that obviously they were going to reject the requirements of the bailout, and one of the potential solutions was to leave the single currency. So I think obviously the way the European Union develops, I mean, look, even in the case of security, it might irritate some states. That the European Union gains more power when it comes to security. Obviously now, with the election of Trump, there has been a number of US presidents who highlighted the fact that NATO states should at least abide by the thresholds, the 2% budgets, when it comes to security and defense. We know that a number of states in Europe are not reaching the 2%, are not investing in security and defense. And we believe, and there is a conception, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, that it is NATO who should defend the European borders. But if the interests have now shifted towards other areas, then the question is, how should we protect our own borders?
About border protection, and because there's always, nowadays more than ever, there's this talk of a European army, and it's increasing more and more, in my opinion at least. I'll say my opinion on this, I've said it before, I'm against a European army, and I'm quite in favor of the common security and defense policy that is there. If it is, I don't know how effective it really is, but I believe it is effective. Obviously, I haven't seen it. But I don't know what your stance is, if you'd like to mention about security in Europe and a potential army, maybe.
And in reality, I'm not against a European army, but the reality is when you have 27 member states, 27 different interests, you have the large states, France and Germany, obviously, who are trying to shape the decision-making process within the European Union. So to have all of them agree, especially on how to use an army, they can barely agree on sanctions. Can you imagine a European army when you still have member states which are neutral? I mean, look at Malta, but also look at Ireland. So obviously there can be some skepticism, and it can lead, obviously, to some states who decide then that their place should not be in the EU. Obviously, we have seen scenario with Finland, Sweden, that they decided to step or leave their neutrality status in order for them to join NATO. But then the question is will NATO be still willing, especially with President Trump, to invest in the security and defense in Europe?
Well, if Trump does what he promised to do, and that is just to not fund NATO anymore, then I believe Turkey would be the largest investor in NATO, because after the US, it's Turkey. So I don't know. Countries will have to step up afterwards, definitely. But will they step up is my question, and I don't think.
And will European states leave the responsibility of security and defense to Turkey?
No, I don't. I wouldn't think so, really. Turkey have been trying to enter the Union for years now as well. They've always been rejected.
But even Turkey has multiple interests. I mean, if you look at the conflict in Ukraine, it was still very much a neutral.
It's a very divided country as well, ideologically.
You have seen also in the Middle East, Turkey has been strongly critical of the Israeli strategy. So yes, there has been at the moment the focus is that obviously we are the majority of US member states are in NATO, so NATO should protect our own borders. But the situation might come that there has been less interest in the past. I mean, before Trump left his office in the previous election, the US was already removing a number of soldiers from Germany. And they're stationed in Germany, but then with the election of Joe Biden,
they were reinstated.
They were reinstated, but obviously there are much. The interests of the great powers have shifted. It is no longer in Europe. It's mostly placed around Asia and obviously Africa.
I guess that makes sense, obviously.
I understand all that you're saying with regards to European armies, and countries have different interests, and to get them to agree, it's already a hell of a task. However, at the same time, obviously, if you have the situation where NATO becomes heavily underfunded, essentially by the US, I think that kind of forces the European states to get together, at least the biggest ones. I don't think you will see all European states contribute to the European army per se. I think there are states that are not really gonna, like Malta, realistically cannot contribute as such.
And even wars are now different; they're not just.
Apart from that, but at the same time, I think if NATO essentially loses a lot of its power, I think you'll see countries like France and Germany collaborating, at least between themselves, not necessarily the European Union, but it would be in the name of Europe. So realistically, I think that is very realistic.
Even in the EU, you already have PESCO. I mean, you have the solidarity clause. France was one of the first to use the solidarity clause when obviously had a number of terrorist attacks, and states are required to help if other EU member states request their assistance. Whether it will work in case of defense and security, then obviously that is another question. But states do join in peacekeeping missions, and obviously some kind of collaboration already exists.
I was going to ask you a question now. Well, we've already touched upon it, but how do you see the European Union evolving to address the challenges of sort of the changing global order, changing the world? Because everyone says Europe is weak. Most people at least say Europe is weak because they don't have an army, they don't have really, they don't have hard power. But I feel like Europe does hold a lot of soft power, in my opinion, again. Don't know what if you want to add something or not.
I don't know. At the same time, when we're talking about a European army and all of these issues, my primary worry about this is, okay, so NATO is gonna, defund itself practically and get out of the continent. So, of course, the European powers have to, raise their own mantle to protect themselves. But will that army then just be used in foreign wars?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Are we gonna form a European army to fight in Ukraine?
No, that's one of the main concerns, I believe, as to why. That's why I think Dr. Cachia said there's 27 states, 27 different ideologies.
The European Union usually takes a secondary role. I mean, you were. I don't know if you were born when. No, I don't think you were born.
I was born in 2004.
So a decade later, the fall of Yugoslavia.
Okay. No, I don't remember that.
That was a very.
I was there.
For many, it was an embarrassing event for the European Union. Obviously, you have a conflict at the core of the EU, even though they were not member states. Obviously, you had the conflict between Serbia and the other states. And then at some point, it was the United States who actually intervened. The European Union even took its time to recognize the independence of these states, out of fear that it would lead, the independence of these states would lead to a conflict, which still led to a conflict. But then it was the United States which intervened. I mean, look at the war between Serbia and Kosovo. The conflict, it is, again, the United States and NATO that intervened. But then the European Union intervened at a much later stage in order, obviously, as part of the peacekeeping operation. So I don't think that the European Union wants to turn into a global power which would attack a state. You mentioned Ukraine. The question is obviously, should Ukraine be a member of the European Union? And there has been a number of discussions on that, for the fact that its institutions were already considered weak before the conflict. So if Ukraine had to join the European Union, would it lead or it push the EU to participate in a conflict which it does not want to participate?
I mean, if Ukraine joins, in my opinion, if not now, even before that, then why wouldn't, for example, a country like Turkey join? Because they both don't fit the criteria of a member state. So why would the question of Ukraine obviously came about because of Russia attacking it and obviously war at the doorstep of Europe now. But why should it be a member? I don't really know the talk.
I mean, if it's abide by the criteria, but at the moment, obviously, the problem is that it might lead to the European Union. It might lead the European Union to participate in a conflict which many states do not want to participate. They are sending some armaments. Sanctions have been placed on Russia, but obviously no one wants a regional war between the different powers of the EU. But beyond Ukraine, obviously there are other candidate states. I mean, the application of Georgia has been suspended both by the EU and Georgia itself. But then, obviously, if the European Union, the problem is that if the European Union continues to allow member states to join in, it means that it is much more difficult then for member states to agree on the way forward. The larger it is, the problem, the more problematic it becomes, because obviously you have to cater for the interests of everyone.
No.
I just want to mention one thing, and my usual skepticism of, well, government bodies in general, whatever they are, whether it's European or not, national or not, just generally comes from my cynicism, I guess, that most authorities are up to nothing good, really. Now, that's my personal opinion. Feel free to disagree, right? But with that said, when it comes to a European army, that is basically my, I guess, the framework through which I look at it, which is that
You don't trust the government?
I don't trust the government, no, and I see no reason why, me in Malta, let's say if there is a European army, and let's say if there is a conscription type thing or a draft, whatever, need to get involved in conflicts that, one, I have no power to change, two, I did not create or aid or whatever, nor probably did my own prime minister or foreign minister, whatever. So I assume no responsibility for whatever war I might end up in the case that there is a European army. Now, obviously, you might tell me, listen, you're talking about a conscription, a draft, you're talking about European army, so you're talking about something hypothetical that will only really occur if the situation is really, really chaotic or there is a huge global conflict. I understand. I'm using an extreme example, but the point of the extreme example is to make the point that, hey, listen, realistically, this is not my war. Whatever war it is, it's not going to be my war. There's no reason for me to be at all implicated in the consequences of this. That's where I come from.
But there's also the issue that wars are shifting. I mean, look at the tradition, yes.
No, yes, for sure.
But now it's much more on cybersecurity, cyber attacks. Malta is technically neutral. It's still neutral, so we cannot participate in wars. And there has been an agreement within the political system that obviously Malta would not participate in a conflict because we do not have any resources and we do not have the technology which would require to participate in a conflict. We do participate in peacekeeping missions, and I think they are very important, but I don't think that we would participating in a conflict.
I'd like to touch on a bit on Malta with regards to the EU. Firstly, I mean, obviously when it comes to, as you're saying, like defense and security, Malta is obviously very limited in what it can do to help. But let's leave that aside for a second. Do you think the Maltese people and the Maltese government are happy essentially with the European vision, or where they think they're headed?
Obviously, the European Union, there has been multiple visions. One of the debates which was raised that sometimes European citizens don't even know what the EU actually what is the EU actually doing. And I think the European Union is contributing positively in various areas, beyond the fact that we are using EU funds to strengthen the country's economy and the country's industries. So yes, I think there should at least be an attempt to raise more awareness on what the EU is about. A few years ago, there has been a conference on the future of Europe, but unfortunately, little has come out of that conference. There has been a number of initiatives, but beyond that, I think little was achieved.
So I would, from that, like the Maltese are quite apathetic towards the EU, you'd say?
I think there has been a positive trend. If you look at the last Eurobarometer surveys, and the European Union is seen positive by the majority of the Maltese. Beyond the fact that they seem positive, also the institutions of the European Union are seen as positive, including the European Parliament. I think in Malta it has more support than the actual Maltese Parliament. So if you look at the last Eurobarometer surveys, it highlights the level of trust for the Maltese Parliament, European Parliament, and so on. So yes, I think obviously Malta is a very small country, a centralized system. There has been a growing, been from 2002 onwards. This growing formation of the European Union doesn't mean that Maltese know how the EU institutions work. Usually, I think, which might be a problem in the future, the European Union is mostly associated with funds. And at some point, these funds will be reduced because obviously our economy is growing at one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, and Malta will become a net contributor for the EU. And that obviously, when it happens, or if it happens, it means that we need to shift the way we portray the European Union.
I mean, about the Malta trusting the European Parliament, I don't have them in front of me, but I remember them. In terms of voter turnout, it was one of the highest in Europe for the European Parliament elections. It was like over 70%.
It's still a decline.
It did decline.
So
the elections is like 80.
If you look at the second-order elections, second-order elections, for those who don't know, the theory is the fact that national elections are seen as a priority for voters when compared to local, regional, and European elections, because obviously they believe that they will not impact their way of life, which is why there is less incentive for people to actually turn out to vote for these elections. As I said, the turnout for the 2019-2024 European elections have increased, but it's still 50.5%.
Overall, you're saying?
Overall.
Yeah, it is.
In Malta, it was 70% or 72%. So half of the European voters still opted to not vote.
Yeah, there were
beyond the fact that obviously political parties also approach them as a secondary elections, because they feel that there are more challenges. Obviously, you have Eurosceptic political parties, far right or far left political parties, which usually tend to do better in these elections. So the idea there is, especially the parties in government, if they lose the elections, they will say that they have gained their legitimacy in the national election, while they respect the people's votes. They had a program which was voted for in the national elections, and they will abide by that program. So yes, I think even in Malta, more needs to be done, and more needs to be done by the EU in order, obviously, to try and raise more awareness on what is actually doing.
I agree with you on that, especially.
Because look at the campaigns in Malta. We're discussing everything beyond the European Union. And the last 2004 European election, it was simply based at some point, although the main political parties and even the smaller parties published their manifestos, but then we ended up, obviously, on the debates on political corruption.
So it's the same thing.
It was quite funny to see a European candidates debate, and all they did was talk about Maltese corruption. I understand it, don't get me wrong, but at the same time,
but
you need to promote yourself.
Exactly, you're going for Europe.
But
not
beyond promoting yourself, it's promoting EU.
You promote Europe, you promote the Union. Yeah. That's the main thing, and that's what will get people to hopefully vote for you.
But then obviously it depends. Political parties will try to campaign on an issue which they deemed that voters feel that it's important. So, which is why before the European elections, you always have a barometer surveys with the priorities of the Maltese, and even the Maltese surveys usually highlights the priorities which the Maltese voters have as they are heading for the election, and this is what usually a cue for political parties then to focus on those issues. Inadvertently, sometimes we campaign, we discuss these issues at the national level without realizing that obviously they are issues which also can directly and indirectly be affected by the European Union.
I wanted to mention something because obviously we have already spoken about the rise of like right-wing or far-right parties. I'm going to say right-wing because I'm assuming not all of them are far-right, but a lot of these parties can be characterized commonly that they are Eurosceptic, at least. You can kind of see it mostly more on the right side than on the left side, whether they're far right or far left or not. And obviously, we don't really have a party like that in Malta. Imperium Malta, I wouldn't say, obviously, it doesn't really exist.
Imperium Europa.
Imperium Europa, right. See, that's how unpopular it is. I don't even know the exact name, right? Now, obviously, a lot has been made that the Nationalist Party is not really even right wing. They're kind of just floating with the wind, essentially. And
Can I mention? I think beyond Eurosceptic, I think the first thing is some of them are populist, and then it's very much. When populism is involved, it's very difficult to distinguish between their approach towards the European Union, because obviously populist means that you are simply using an issue in order to gain political advantage, and that issue might not necessarily be part of the fundamental principles that your party might have.
yes, no, I agree with that completely. So my question would be, do you think that the fact that we don't really have a right-wing party here in Malta is because, as we said earlier, and we established earlier, that most people actually trust the EU, so that isn't an issue that a populist leader can grab and say, okay, let's make a party out of this?
I think in Malta's case, it's not the European Union; it's the political system. Which is
yes,
very much.
I figured, yes, but
a two-party mentality. But we have seen in the last European election, the other political parties, the other independent candidates, they did manage to gain thousands of votes. I mean, Cassola
got
71,000, was it?
no,
No,
we
sorry.
have been elected
So I saw
71,000.
like 15 or 20, something like that.
I think 15. He started
15, I
with-
believe.
with
And the
15.
first count was 15, I believe. I'm not sure.
I saw a post. He is 71, so I do apologize to Mr. Arnold. That's all.
I think Norman Hall got 6,000.
Yeah, like
7,000.
5 or 6,000.
And then there was
That's first count.
first count.
First
yes.
count. Borchmanche
Borchmanche
got like
around
2 or 3.
3.
And then Simon Mercia, I don't know how much he got.
And even, what's his name, James?
Yes, he got James like 1,500 votes, which is still a
So votes
significant.
are distributed, but because we use the single transferable vote, it means that you need to inherit votes
Exactly.
in order to gain it.
I don't like the system. I think.
I mean, but if you look at then the first past the post that the
That's
British
worse.
use, I mean, you can only get. I mean, if you are 4 candidates and one of them gains one more than the others, he's elected, which means that
you get a minority.
yes, you only have 20 or 25% of the vote, but you are still elected.
I mean, in the previous British election, the National Liberals got like 14%. I mean, less than 14% of the vote, but they got 14% of the seats. While Reform UK got 14% of the seats, but like 2, 3 seats.
They got 2 or 3 seats because they won less constituencies. They won Clacton and something else.
One thing I mean, as you know, in Malta, we have a system. It was introduced in just before the 1997 election, which based on proportionality. So we have a clause which highlights the fact that within a two-party system, the party which wins the largest amount of votes in the national election is given one additional seat in order for them to be able to govern. So Malta is pretty much based on votes. Other states it's very much based on seats. So you look, we mentioned the fact that obviously you look at even the US presidential system. And popular vote was important, but people were not looking at popular votes. They were looking at the states and the way they were being won, because obviously it is the political part, which is the candidate which wins the largest amounts of electoral colleges, which will then lead the country.
Yeah.
So I don't think it is based on the EU. It is very much based on the political system. But in the previous election, Norman Lowell managed to gain thousands of votes. The same thing in Cassola. The Cassola in 2004, he won 24,000 first count votes.
Yes, he won like over 20,000.
So that
Even
was,
then, we're mentioning Lowell. Lowell's voter count decreased from
2019.
from 2019.
The degrees.
So I mean, even then, the Maltese electorate still the amount of
then,
people willing
yeah,
to vote for the far right
you
decreased.
need to discuss then what are the political parties' approach toward the issues being dealt by Norman Lowell, which is migration. And we have seen the political parties more often than not shifting towards the right on the issue, and they accuse each other of being populist, but at the same time, their strategies are very similar to each other. It doesn't mean that there is a political apathy towards the problem. It means that they are trying, obviously, to cater for that issue, highlighting the fact that actually something is being done. And I don't think Norman Lowell's campaign this year was as effective as the previous years.
No, definitely
No,
not.
he did not go to any debates. He was practically invisible.
Terence went to Terence Allou, I believe his name is.
And now we obviously have the rise of social media. I don't think he was that present on social media beyond some interviews. So you still need to campaign. He still managed to gain 5 or 6,000.
Cazzola run in 2019?
Yes,
I think he always ran.
And how did he get, I'm assuming, way less votes?
He got less, yes.
Yeah, right.
But he was part of the 8. I think he was part of in 2019. He was part of the. Was he or did he just?
I'll check. I'm not sure. I am not sure.
Mike,
I think he was still with the ADP.
Point I was going to make is that I think because Norman Lowell lost votes from 2019 till the next one, and I think that the reason that he lost votes is because most people who voted for him. Okay, I'm not going to say most because I don't know, but a lot of people who voted for him out of protest rather than agreement with the ideology. And I think a lot of those people actually turned to Cazzola in the last election. So I think if I were to theorize and speculate, essentially I would say that is probably why he lost votes, Norman Lowell.
So it'll be interesting to see how much Cazzola inherited from Norman Lowell after.
Yeah, he probably inherited most from them.
Yeah, actually, that makes sense.
Cazzola was independent already in 2019, and he was
just ahead
2,000 votes compared to now.
I think he got more votes than AD in 2019.
Sure. Well, compare him to now. Now he got 15,000 votes after all counts.
Jesus.
So that's from 13,000. And in 2019, ADPD he got more than them. It was Carmel Cacopardo and Mina Tolu. They got combined 1,800 votes. Not 900.
And this year, I think we had 35 candidates.
We had more candidates. We had more independent candidates for sure.
So 35 candidates for 6 seats. Obviously, votes will be distributed. So beyond Roberta Metsola and Alexa Saliba, they gained the largest amount for the Nationalist and the Labour Party. Obviously, then the question was who is going to inherit votes. So that is an issue, obviously, that the political system, the system we use in order to elect representatives will come into play.
Yes, I agree with you. So to some degree, I expected that answer, obviously, because I understand that political systems work a certain type of way.
But you never know another far-right might emerge at some point. I mean,
for sure. And I think it's more than likely, actually.
I feel like in Malta, though, the lines between red and blue are so blurry nowadays that people vote to be different.
But that's exactly the point.
Different way.
With Cassola's new political party, with the Progressive political party, at some point you would expect an anti-woke political party to emerge.
Well, I don't think that like in the Maltese situation we're gonna see a plurality of parties anytime soon. So I believe at least that the biggest chance for change or having these either anti-woke parties or like really progressive parties is not through like third party systems, but rather through factionalism within the two major parties anyways. Because that way, well, you already have a platform to use on, and a charismatic enough leader can influence his own party to change. But with the partisan mindset that the country has, I don't think we're ever going to have a proper third party.
I think yes, there's obviously a partisan mindset in Malta, but at the same time, I think there's going to be a point, and I don't know when this is, but I believe there's going to be a point where people are fed up truly with both parties being essentially the same thing, knowing that they're part of a system which benefits both. I think it will come to a point where people realize that, look, they see through it. And if you look at Malta in general, people are very, very conservative, I would say. So the rise of a right-wing party doesn't even have to be far right, in my opinion, but a right-wing party is inevitable. I think it's definitely coming, whether it's in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I think it's definitely on the way.
I think obviously smaller political parties in Malta have a lot of challenges they face beyond the main political parties. The fact that political parties own their own media companies, so they can
and the media
establish a link with their voters. But there has been a decline in the 2022 national election. There has been more people who did turn out did not turn out to vote, but more people actually writing stuff on their voting ballots.
More protests.
So
protests
there
was,
is
quote
more,
unquote.
whether that can change the mentality, obviously, it's another challenge, another debate.
I think that like the main issue with the third parties. I mean, this week alone we had the announcements of 3 new left-wing political parties with Partito Malta Progressiva, Il Collettivo saying they're going to start their own party, and Cassola's party. So we have 3 parties coming, small parties on the left already. I mean, they either unite or they're just going to be 3 small blocks.
We don't know if they will establish a coalition at some point.
I mean, I would assume so, but if they don't, I mean, that's just a waste of resources. Then, like, if you go to 4 years ago and you go on the right, you had Imperium Europa, you had ABBA, Partito Popolare, Movimento Patriota Maltin, and they did not collaborate with one another. So you have just 4 parties saying the exact same things practically and being divided. Which is why I think that, you know, factionalism within the main parties is, you know, the way to go for change. Because the small parties just refuse to work with each other for some reason.
Obviously, they're stubborn.
It's not being stubborn. It might have different strategies. They do not want to be associated with the others. I mean, the idea of coalition emerged after 2024 European elections. That obviously a lot of votes were scattered around the independent candidates and smaller political parties. And the idea there that obviously there has to be a way so that they can keep at least inheriting each other's votes. But then it's very much a challenge within the political system.
I mean, in Malta, it's very difficult for an independent candidate to be elected in general.
If you look at what is interesting, if you look at the ballots within Ireland, is that candidates are based on alphabetical order, not on party. So we have a very similar system, single transferable votes, but when it comes to the list, it's alphabetical order based on the name and surname of that candidate rather than their party.
Isn't it the same?
So if you have
but it's the party and then it's alphabetical.
Yes, but they are based simply alphabetical. So that would be interesting to see whether it would affect the way people vote, whether it would help them to obviously to vote for candidates from multiple political parties.
I think it would, because lots of people, or at least I know lots of people who just vote first one from each, and that's it. Or for example, they just see red and vote for the first one for red and just go down.
Like the one of the, I guess, worst things about democracy is that people should be informed about who they're voting for, but then you have people who do that.
Yeah,
I have no idea who the people are essentially, and they just go on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and let's go.
And I was going to bring this up again regarding Phidias, going back to the beginning of the episode, Phidias' interview. In that same question with Andrew Tate, he was asked, "Is democracy real?" And Phidias replied with, I believe, "No, we have an illusion of democracy in Europe. Don't know what you think of it." If I give my opinion, I feel like we don't really have a true democracy.
I think we have a democracy, but we take a lot of things taken for granted.
Fair enough.
I mean, fundamental freedoms, and obviously we have seen in the past in Europe and elsewhere that they can easily be threatened. I mean, the democracy is not perfect; it's flawed. Finding something which is perfect, obviously, it's nearly impossible. But we can try to progress towards.
Yeah, definitely.
But then it is something that obviously it is better than any other system.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is definitely flawed, heavily, but nothing's perfect.
I just want to point out we're talking about democratic principles more than democracy itself, because obviously every country
that's just the system in general.
But every country takes a different democratic approach.
Right.
So, because for example, you would call America a democracy, but it's technically a constitutional republic. So you just need to make that distinction. Democratic principles, yes, I'm a big fan. But some democracies, so-called democracies, I would argue are not.
Would you agree? The U.S. presidential election, would you feel that it represents the democratic principles? The fact that you are voting for an electoral college, which might decide to vote for other candidates.
Yeah, I don't think it really...
It's not direct democracy.
No,
at
it's
all.
not.
But that's the point, because America isn't a direct democracy.
Yeah, I guess. But then why paint it as democracy and freedom and all that?
Because in the word
obviously
of
it's all rhetoric.
lexicon,
Yeah.
people call it a democracy. But,
Yeah.
in theory or on paper, I guess it's technically not.
Yeah.
And
But direct
it is the
democracy.
United States, because America is the whole region.
Oh.
Yes. Well, I have been saying America at this
We
point
forgot
for
he's a
7
lecturer.
episodes.
We forgot he's a lecturer.
But no, I mean, look at, obviously, the United States
Yeah,
is a
yes,
good
yes.
example. Look at the first Trump
Administration.
administration. The question is whether the institutions are strong enough to withstand a grabbing of power. And we have seen autocratic regimes which are extremely popular in a number of countries in Latin America. That obviously they use populist policies. When there is a challenge, they do a referendum with people support. So obviously it is in that way that they're trying to gain power. But yes, I think there has been a limitations when it comes to democratic principles, as you rightly said. But obviously the way forward is to try to look at those shortcomings.
You try and perfect the system, or not perfect the system, but make sure to cater for all the abuses and try and restrict them from ever happening.
Yeah, obviously.
Which is obviously difficult, and there's corruption and whatnot. But I wanted to make a point about partisanism in Malta. Yes, of course, the two major parties have a large, hold over the populace, and through obviously the party stations that you mentioned, that they operate through media in Malta, because the most popular media in Malta is still the television and it's still the radio, and things like that. However, we've seen a trend around Europe and the world really where people are starting to move away from two-party systems. People are starting to be very, very skeptical of these. I mean, okay, so for example, in the USA, obviously Trump won as a Republican, but when you realize the amount of types of people he's had around him, like RFK or Tulsi Gabbard, who are not Republicans by any stretch of the imagination, but they try to run as Democrats and then they try to run as independents. In the UK, you see the rise of the popularity of the Reform Party, headed by Nigel Farage. You're seeing in Germany and so many states where people are moving away from the traditional or who holds power for the longest amount of time as parties, and you're seeing that transition happen in real time. Now, the thing is with Malta, I think it's not necessarily happened yet, or we can't detect it yet, is because, quite frankly, we're always delayed. The stereotype in Malta, we always get things late. And I think people haven't actually yet shifted towards social media, as a lot of the world has done.
But haven't we?
I don't think.
But look at the dangers of social media. I mean, look at the last Romanian election with TikTok. The fact that there is allegedly disinformation being promoted through TikTok. I mean, look at Brexit, the idea that obviously disinformation was being promoted through Twitter, which is now X. So social media has its good things, but it's also being challenging, especially when you have disinformation and trying to combat disinformation, which can have obviously a detrimental effect.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. My point being is that you have the traditional party stations or the media that is towing party lines that people still, I think overwhelmingly in Malta, still trust and watch, right? Not to the same degree of other countries where a lot of that importance on these TV stations and media houses has decreased. In Malta, I'm not saying it hasn't decreased. I'm saying it hasn't decreased enough to change voting patterns and to change...
Yes, I mean, the television stations are still important. They are extremely expensive for political parties, as we have seen. You need a lot of investment in order to maintain this traditional media. Political parties are also focusing on social media nowadays. I think it would be interesting to see the effect of TikTok. It has been banned in a number of countries. There should be a ban in the United States, but we don't know what Trump will do. But obviously, yes, I think in the next elections, we will see social media taking more over than traditional media. I mean, newspapers have been in decline for a number of years, and they also have shifted online as well.
Yep. And with that said, we'll conclude the episode here. But thank you for coming, and it was a very interesting discussion.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
And we'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ко всем гражданам России.
The President of the United States.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.